Okay, perfect. So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us to today's online talk. Today, we're talking about early medieval archaeology and the Victorian archaeologists, particularly like Thomas Bateman, who uncovered many significant grave finds, particularly in Sheffield and the Peak District and surrounding area, many of which are kept at Weston Park Museum, like the famous Benty Grange helmet, which you may have heard of. Now, it's hopefully not long to go until we are able to see some of these artifacts in person on site when we reopen. But being closed has had a huge financial impact. So we are very, very grateful for all the donations that we receive. You can donate at museums-sheffield.org.uk/donate. So today we're joined by Professor Howard Williams from the University of Chester, who has published extensively and researches public archaeology and archaeologies of death and memory. So welcome, Howard.
Hello there.
And just a reminder that we are live right now. So if you do have any questions at all, please do feel free to pop those in the comments box below and we will have time to answer a few at the end. So that's enough of my spiel now. Howard, I think we will pass over to you to begin your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you, Sheffield Museum, and hello, everybody, and welcome to my little short talk. Hopefully, I'll be able to share my second screen with you. Let's try that, and hopefully that will work. Jessica's nodding, so I think that means it's okay. So yes, welcome. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is hello. That's not doing the right thing. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's looking right. I just not doing. Is the Barrow Night and the search for the Anglo-Saxons, Thomas Bateman's early medieval archaeology. And this is a topic that I think has been neglected. I have been researching the early Middle Ages as an archaeologist and a historian for 25 years. And I've been part of that has been studying the history of early medieval archaeology, the Anglo-Saxon archaeology specifically. And I don't think there's been any real comment about this character, Thomas Bateman. Now, part of the inspiration for this was going back to Sheffield Museum. I was an undergraduate archaeology student at Sheffield back in the 90s, before time itself. And I went to the Weston Park Museum, of course, but I went back there recently. I think it was like 2018, because I was going to the Department of Archaeology to give a research seminar, and I had the opportunity to go back in. And I don't know if it's the same as this now or it's changed, but there's the wonderful Beneath Your Feet gallery, which gives you that introduction to the prehistory and early history of the Sheffield district, which relies so much on the Peak District finds of these Barrow diggers, in particular Thomas Bateman. So there's evidence of me in Sheffield, there's evidence of the gallery, and there's the wonderful maps of locating Sheffield and the relationship with the Peak District and all these archaeological sites. Not all of them in the Peak District, but you know, the bias, because that's where a lot of those early archaeologists in the 19th century were doing their digging in the burial mounds and of the Peak District between Sheffield and Buxton. Okay, so I'm very much aware of this material, being having been an undergraduate at Sheffield, going back there. But this inspired me to look again at this wonderful gallery. And when everything reopens, you'll be able to go and see, as Jessica mentioned, the wonderful. You know, this is the star attraction in many ways, for me anyway, and the early medieval collections, the Benty Grange helmet, the original as discovered, this iron framework with the wonderful boar on top, and the reconstruction in the museum gallery here too. And there's the display case. So I'm just sort of pointing out that any visitor to Sheffield's wonderful museum moving forward and recently has had the opportunity to see this, both the original object and its replica, as well as a host of other burial finds. These are from early medieval graves excavated in the Peak District mainly, and mostly in the 19th century. So my point is, if you visit and want to understand about the early Middle Ages, the 5th to 7th centuries in your area or in the Sheffield area, you are basically looking upon the discoveries, the activities of a very small number of gentlemen and their labourers in that 1840 to 1860 bracket. And despite many modern excavations and many many new exciting discoveries by metal detectorists, commercial archaeologists, research excavations. For example, you can also see finds from the Wig Below excavations by Professor John Collis of Sheffield University, who taught me as an undergraduate. You know, there's many things that have been discovered since, but we're still, for our understanding of those centuries in the Peak District and the areas around it, including the Sheffield District, we still rely on those 19th century, those Victorian period discoveries. And here's a reconstruction of the container and the appliques on it that were discovered in the Benty Grange burial. And here from Cow Low, this wonderful glass bowl and this beautiful gold pin set, and other amazing finds. These are from different burial sites, but you can see them as part of a display. And we now know that the other point to say is that these have not diminished in importance. And while we've got many new finds from across the country, these Peak District finds are some of the most amazing for particularly the end, the final phase of furnished burial in the early Anglo-Saxon period in the 7th century. And these finds with these garnet and gold finds, they speak of communities with long distance connections and accessing the latest styles and the latest religion, because of course one of them is a cross, and some of these objects allude to cross motifs in their design. So these are the 7th century is the conversion period, the period where the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are converting to Christianity. First Kent, last Sussex, and Mercia and Northumbria somewhere in the middle of the 7th century. In other words, these finds still are of national and international importance that were discovered in the Peak District burial mounds by and are now in the Sheffield Museum. And indeed, we're lucky that this is a wonderful moment to learn about these, because just published is a new book by Phil Sidebottom called Pexaitna, which is the Old English name for the people of the Peak, the people of the Anglo-Saxon Peak District, and that's with Windgather Press. So I would encourage you, if you want to read more about this topic, and he looks not only at the grave finds of the 19th century, but at the stone sculpture and many other archaeological discoveries more recently. But it shows, as you can see from the cover, with the Benty Grange helmet there at the top, you know, these finds still dominate our understanding, and they're nationally and internationally important. But what hasn't been done, and there's me, you see, I'm at selfies are evidence I was there, you see. It's not self-indulgent, it's evidence I was there. So here's me with the portrait of Thomas Bateman. And also you can learn in that gallery something of the context of these discoveries, because there's an exhibition showing you some of the ways in which those finds originally were in Thomas Bateman's collections from his Barrow digging. And so we rely a lot of this collection comes from Thomas Bateman's activities, known as the Barrow Knight. He was a son of a local doctor, an amateur antiquarian, William Bateman. So his dad was an antiquarian, so there was a bit of antiquarianism in the blood, but also so was money and industry. And his grandfather was a wealthy Manchester cotton merchant, so a bit of industry and colonial dynamic there to almost everybody in these coming to wealth in the 19th century. He built his own house almost the same time as he was building his house here in Lombardale Hall in Yulgrave. He was started excavating. So his engagement with the Peak District is one of being a sort of a nouveau riche gentleman in his neo-Gothic house. So it's of the time, sort of built to look a bit medieval. So he's living the Middle Ages, in a sense, living the past, and going out and barrow digging. And the collection that you can now see in Sheffield Museum is in the inheritance following the death of his son in 1893 of his own museum, which he displayed to visitors. So he was an antiquarian as well as an archaeologist. So the archaeologist term is someone who goes out and digs stuff, but you know, all these characters were doing it so they could display the remains in museums. And so this guy, this Thomas Bateman, is absolutely pivotal to understanding the collections, and his books are published now on Google Books. So in my day, when I was doing this research, I had to go to the original copies in university libraries, but now they're freely available. And his 1848, Wikipedia has it wrong and says 1847, Vestiges of the Antiquities of Derbyshire, which is a lovely titled book. I wish I had books with those type of titles, but the publishers won't allow it. Is one of the first sort of this new generation of barrow diggers, and many of these barrow diggers weren't publishing their finds. And what's important about Bateman is he didn't simply collect these and display them. Unlike previous generations, he was self-consciously aware of the need to scientifically record and disseminate this information to like-minded gentlemen, and perhaps a few by the end of this period, gentlewomen too, but particularly middle and upper class men who have a shared interest in early discoveries from these islands. And this was a very self-conscious move to not only dig, to go out as an activity and barrow dig, but also to display these finds and to disseminate them. So he did some of the best publications we have from that era. Obviously they're dated, the methodologies are atrocious by modern standards. Nothing is being properly recorded, but at least sharing the discoveries. And then a little later on, 10 years diggings in Celtic and Saxon grave hills from the counties of Derby, Stafford and York from 1848 to 1858. And not such a catchy title, but one that is at least descriptive and accurate of what it contains. And that was published in the year of his death in 1861. And most commentators talking about the legacy of Bateman focus on the fact that, of course, when digging into burial mounds in the Peak District, he was mainly finding late Neolithic, Bronze Age, early Bronze Age burials. And so this is a montage from different pages of his publications to show you his crude but still helpful plans of some of these crouched inhumation and cremation burials that were being discovered by Bateman. And Llewellyn Jowett, the antiquarian illustrator, I think was responsible for almost all of these images that were included in his publication. So obviously nowhere near as good enough as what we require in modern scientific archaeological excavations, but still valuable information. And a lot of the Sheffield Museum's collections show you this. And this is the frontispiece of Vestiges of Antiquities, a very, very you know, dated, but still, I love the dog. Look at that poor dog looking sad at a funeral scene of an ancient Britain. Now, this is before the proper adoption of the new three-age system that was developed by the Danish and advocated by Thomson and then Vorsa. And so the prehistory for Bateman, when he started doing his barrow digging, it was simply the Britons before the Romans. There was no real sense of time depth. This is even before a conception of geologic time was fully disseminated. So while some publications have been coming out for 50 years, 60 years of the antiquity of the earth, but for people like Bateman who are barrow digging, it was simply them days. The Britons, Celts, then Roman interlude, and then Saxons, and then medieval. So this was very much a time when the ancient Britons are the primordial inhabitants, and that's what he understood those what we now call late Neolithic, early Bronze Age finds to be. What hasn't been addressed is that Bateman was also fascinated in the Saxon or the early medieval grave finds. And that's where my interests lie, because the origins of Anglo-Saxon archaeology, while there are some barrow diggers in the 18th century that deserve our attention, it was really in this craze of early archaeological diggings in the 19th century, of which Bateman was one, where we start to see the development of an Anglo-Saxon archaeology. So while these are 17th century cinerary urns, early Anglo-Saxon creation urns found in Norfolk, this is a 19th century representation of barrows that were excavated in the 18th century, but it was really in the 19th century in these developing archaeological societies nationally and locally and regionally that we see the development of an awareness that these furnished graves of the early Anglo-Saxon period, the 5th to 7th centuries, are the clue to the origins of England. That was the way it was understood. And that started to be a focus of a range of of early archaeologists and antiquaries. And these are some of the key characters. And I've emboldened Thomas Bateman's name in the alphabetical list. And in my previous research, this is just some representations of a happy female skeleton from the Isle of Wight, as an example, and some urns from Cambridgeshire, just to illustrate that these archaeologists were not simply doing a lot more excavation, they were starting to share. They were a network of scholars who were talking to each other, meeting with each other, showing each other the finds. And in my previous academic publications, I've tried to explore these and talk about a lot of these individuals and how they were writing and how they were talking about these early Anglo-Saxon burials as a kind of material history. They didn't really believe the Venerable Bede and Gildas and these other and later Anglo-Saxon chronicles. They weren't seeing archaeology as a handmaiden to history, as often modern scholars say they did. They actually saw archaeology as better and reliable, and they were very confident in their discoveries, were writing the first stage of the history of the English. And so in my previous publications, which were all on my Academia Edu page, if anyone wants to go to see, I talk about these scholars, but I haven't really addressed Thomas Bateman. I've talked about the other scholars, and I've just quickly flipped back, like Richard Neville, Charles Roach Smith, Thomas Wright, William Wiley. I haven't really addressed Bateman. But this is the kind of thing that they say. And this is John Mitchell Kemble, who was the paramount philologist and friend of the Grimm brothers, writing about folklore, mythology, Anglo-Saxon history. And he wrote this clear statement about these finds, saying that the urns of the old Saxons and those of the Anglo-Saxons are in truth identical. They are Saxon in one place as well as the other. The bones are those of men whose tongues we speak and whose blood flows in our veins. This was the closest we had to a blood and soil approach to the Anglo-Saxons, of racially the same peoples, an offshoot of the Teutonic race, settling across in our shores in the 5th century. And Kemble, who lived in Germany at the time when he was writing this, envisaged this relationship as one of a connection between the same people, a replacement of the Britons with new incoming Germanic peoples. And they other quotes include, they derive our antiquities from the same period. The graves are a particularly rich and interesting, says Thomas Wright, a tolerable estimate of our civilization, of our ancestors before the days of St. Augustine. So this is what they saw, a strong and unsuspecting light upon the conditions of our ancestors at a point where when historical information is particularly meagre and obscure. So archaeology sheds light for the first time on the early English. On all departments of archaeology that related to our Saxon forefathers was the most neglected. The remains of the Teutonic races were the last to be discriminated and fully understood. So they were seeing this archaeology as witnesses on history, and as more reliable, as Kemble says in 1849, more reliable than the historical record. So this was a confident set of scholars who were trying to use archaeology to write a history. And that's where Bateman fits in, because Bateman was connected to these scholars. He was publishing, he was a member of the British Archaeological Association. He was sharing his information with them. He was writing in their pages, and he was inspired by Kemble and Roach Smith and others to see his local antiquities as part of a national story. And therefore, as a scholar and a gentleman, he was networking in to London-based society. This was about social position as a Barrow digger, as part of a club, just as some people like to be part of a clique on Twitter today, or Facebook friends group. I got there at the end. There was a cachet to being a gentleman antiquary and to be a Barrow digger. And Bateman's prehistoric finds were part of that, but so were his Saxon finds. So his discoveries of bronze drafts from Cold Eaton, these are playing pieces, his discovery from Brushfield, these are all finds you can now see wonderfully in the flesh, in the real, in Sheffield Museum. These are the 19th century drawings from his publications, this sort of relic box, or cosmetic box as they're often called, these bits of Celtic hanging bowls, we find in the graves. These are prestigious bronze vessels. All of these finds, and these are the drawings of the very finds you can still see in the museum, are shed light in terms of, as Bateman saw them, on the local part of a broader national story of the origins of the English. And here, May the 3rd, 1848, in a high and bleak situation, the Benty Grange helmet and other artifacts were found. And this is his report in 10 years diggings. So you can see how he's already fitting these discoveries into a national picture. And here are the key observations I want to share with you. These are preliminary. There's other things I want to say, and I haven't published this yet, but I want to share with you. These are sort of the key points I think you can take from what Bateman says in his own reports, in his own words, about how he understood these finds, why he saw them as important. Bateman was astute and informed. He knew the latest thinking. He recognized that few of these were of the pagan Saxons. There were no early finds he could see. And he says that the Saxons only took up permanent lodgment in the county when Christianity was adopted. We must leave the first century of the Saxon invasion to the impenetrable darkness which surrounds it. And you talk to most scholars today and they're in the same situation. Anyway, that's another point. Benty Grange discoveries prompted the first citation of Beowulf for Anglo-Saxon archaeology. He quoted the boar-crested helmet of Benty Grange in relation to the description of helmets in the 10th century Anglo-Saxon poem. And so the poem in the material record started to be seen, thanks to Bateman's excavations, to be parallel. And it's Benty Grange was the first of several princely graves discovered in the 19th century before Sutton Hoo, including Snape and Brushfield and Taplow. So Benty Grange was really important because it showed an aristocratic princely grave for the first time. And for Bateman, the fact that many of these Saxon graves were inserted into older prehistoric burial mounds spatially articulated for Bateman the racial succession he understood in his mindset as happening between the Celts, the Romans, and the Saxons, who in the same burial mound. And he even liked it to native Indian in meaning Native American, native Indian burial sites, which have evidence of multiple burials within them. So he saw a parallel between the prehistoric, as we would call it, Britons, and Native American savages, as his words, not mine, and then the Saxons replacing them. So this fitted into a narrative he understood of multiple peoples invading these islands and replacing each other. And the grave goods and burial customs materialized the racial characteristics of the Anglo-Saxon civilization as he saw it. And even he was at a cusp where Bateman started to share his skulls from his graves with Thurnham and Davis, who are writing a book called Crania Britannica, attempting to use craniology to characterize the racial attributes of different races, something that's coming back to us now in pseudoscience with ancient DNA research and lots of crazy ideas on the internet and lots of racist thinking in our time. This was the aspiration of Bateman's generation, to write the history of human races as discrete intellectual and cultural traits that you can see in the skulls. Of course, it was all rubbish, but that's what he was trying to do, and he was contributing to, by sharing those skulls. And my point is, this casts a long shadow over subsequent 19th, 20th and 21st century understandings of the Anglo-Saxons through archaeology, both love and ambivalence towards this period of history, use and misuse. So Bateman's legacy for the museum and for us is some love, some hate, but most folks are a little confused by the Anglo-Saxons and their archaeological story. And we have new discoveries all the time. The Staffordshire Hoard, the reconstructed helmet of the Staffordshire Hoard. You can see the potteries. This is the wonderful project going on around Rendlesham in Suffolk. The Operation Nightingale excavating at Barrow Clump, an early Anglo-Saxon cemetery. And there's Paul Mortimer dressed up as King Redwold at Sutton Hoo, and Peggy Piggott as depicted in the new Netflix film The Dig. Just to encapsulate for you that we have this popular culture of the Anglo-Saxons and its archaeology. We're very enthusiastic about it, but it comes with this dark legacy of the Anglo-Saxons and that racial models that were created by that generation of Bateman and his network of early Victorians who were seeing a nationalist view of the origins of England, but also had a view to an imperial and colonial context in which they were trying to write the story of why the English were superior, why they deserved an empire, and why they deserved to be better than everybody else. And the challenge for us as experts, as museum curators, as educators, as researchers, is how do we best tell their story? We've inherited these finds, we've got the material legacy of these discoveries, but how do we tell this story in a 21st century museum for multicultural Britain? And this is Norwich Castle Museum's long-running display telling that story of cultural change in the 5th, 6th century with artifacts and so on. But we still have this ongoing challenge. It's a legacy. And just as we have an ongoing conversation, shall we put it neutrally, about what we do with the repatriation of artifacts acquired from other countries, we also have to have a conversation about what we do with the legacy of these discoveries and the antiquarians that discovered them from the 19th century, and that Victorian blessing and curse that we've inherited of these objects, because they still tell exciting stories. But what are those stories going to be, and how are we developing them in new ways? So that's why I wanted to leave you with a question and some thoughts. And you can check out my 2020 essay on the fight for Anglo-Saxon, both the term and the narratives we tell, because this is a term very contested at the moment, and it's a topic that goes back to the roots of archaeology in the 19th century. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I've definitely learned a lot there. So we've got a little bit of time now for a couple of questions. So if you do have any questions, do pop those in the comments box. So first on, I guess, what is the difference between Anglo-Saxon and early medieval?
Yeah, so these are terms that we use interchangeably in some senses, but there's a whole sort of different, across Europe, there's been a whole series of different traditions of terms used for the 5th to 11th centuries. So you'll see in the popular literature, Dark Ages, which scholars cringe over, but is still widely used. We talk about Anglo-Saxon as a term to refer to pre-conquest culture, language, and society, and we've inherited that term from the 19th century. Early medieval can be used as an alternative term, although we do see, and it has a broader geographical range, and a lot of continental scholars will use early medieval as a term too. But in Scandinavia, they get very confused because they've got other terms too, and that they've got, for example, their Middle Ages doesn't begin to the end of the 11th century, and sometimes the 12th century. They would talk about the Iron Age and the Viking Age. So we have, the problem is we have so many terms. I tend to use early medieval, but when I'm talking about England and particular the period artifacts, we still tend to use Anglo-Saxon, although some people would prefer not to, and that's cool. But some people think it still has an effective use, particularly for public communication. People get confused by early medieval, particularly because there's a tradition in the UK of using it for the late 11th, 12th century too. So it gets a bit confusing. So we either just talk about centuries, or we have to use a term that helps us to encapsulate. But the difference between Anglo-Saxon and early medieval is really one of personal choice of scholars, and sometimes it's just about getting across the point and then explaining what we're talking about once we've made that choice. But most people, I think, at school are taught about Anglo-Saxons as a term, and so it is a term that's well embedded, but it comes with a baggage too, and that's, I think, our challenge of trying to talk, explain these terms. Early medieval is a bit bland, but it has advantages, which is why it tends to be my preferred term.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the methods of the Victorian archaeologists, what did they get right and what did they do wrong?
Well, I mean, the excavation methods were atrocious. So for Benty Grange, we don't even have a plan of how these objects were found. Very little bone survived, I think Bateman recorded. So he did have a trouble, probably didn't even identify he was through the grave before it was just objects on the side of the grave. So it really, I showed you a few grave plans, but they're exceptions. So if they're digging a cemetery of 100 found during a quarrying excavation, the antiquaries come across, they may draw one as a stylized one, maybe the wealthiest grave. So we don't have any proper recording at all. What we have is it's very much like the worst case of modern day metal detectoring, where someone hoiks something out of an in situ context and doesn't record it and goes, look what I found. And if they're really good, they'll take it to the museum and you go, well, where did you find it? Well, somewhere over there. It's that level. And you go, oh. So I suppose what they got right is they did try to start sharing images and descriptions, but almost everything else is wrong by modern standards in terms of method and technique. In terms of their ideas, I'm balancing up here. At one level, I'm trying to criticize them as saying they were inherently trying overtly. This isn't just a casual. And when we talk about racism and racial models, these were overt attempts to write about nationhood and empire explicitly through archaeology. You can't escape it. You can't go, what about it? Oh, you got to understand, man of the time. No, this was an overt, explicit agenda that they wrote about in their works, right? So that is where they got wrong, but they were canny. They understood. He was able to discern the difference between particular kinds of objects and their significance, and they were vaguely aware that burial context mattered, that things from the same grave needed to at least stay together to some extent. That didn't always work. So I'm not forgiving. It's not a case of judging them and forgiving them or criticizing them. It's about being aware that these were scholars working in very different circumstances. And when we talk about Bateman digging, of course, he didn't touch the ground at all. It would be laborers doing this for him while he waltzes up and maybe attends with his wife and children, watching what's going on. So it would resemble nothing like a proper scientific excavation to today. And yet we should neither put these people on a pedestal because they were pioneers or, deride everything they do. Their information they gathered and is still in the museum is wonderful and tells exciting stories, but we have to be aware of the nature of the stories that they were telling and the limitations of what we can say given the nature of how badly they were excavated.
Perfect. And finally, we just got time for one last question. Were there a lot of these come from burial sites? Was there an awareness or understanding for that side of things?
I mean, I think they really did understand that they were in terms of these were Christian 19th century gentlemen. They went to church. Bateman, I didn't include it. Bateman was actually buried with a replica prehistoric vessel on his grave in Yulegreave. You can still visit his grave. So he was acutely aware of the funerary nature and he respected that. But they also, at the time, antiquaries were rightly mocked as grave robbers and ghouls. And there was a lot of literature in the late 18th and early 20th century mocking both in this country and those obsessed with mummies and ancient civilizations. So they are like stereotypes on TV today of particular professions. There is both a truth in it and we can see the stereotype for what it is. But they were aware they were uncovering the grave, and that was an important context. But they weren't squeamish about that. I've read some accounts where they do actually reflect on the desecration that the Barrow digger is about, but they were also aware, and this is an important final point, that they were saving stuff that was being destroyed already. This is long before modern development, where archaeologists are basically digging most of what we dig before it gets destroyed to build a new road, a new Tesco's or whatever it may be. But they were acutely aware that quarrying, agricultural improvements, mining, railway embankments, canal building was destroying the natural rural landscape. So at one level, they were sort of early conservationists in a sense. They were aware they were destroying to salvage, to preserve. So some of them were quite passionate in that regard. Of course, there's very aristocratic landowning attitudes there, paternalistic attitudes there, as today. But still, they did have a sense that they were saving for the nation. And I think there was at least at one level, there was a natural course of action for those collections to end up in public, facilities. And I think it's only if that's part of, I think, an appropriate course that they didn't stay as private collections. They did end up, many of these did end up in places where everyone can go to see them.
Perfect, brilliant. That's all been so interesting. So thank you so much for joining us. I've learnt a lot, and I hope everybody watching has as well. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching, and hopefully keep an eye out for our other upcoming virtual talks and tours and events coming up as well. There is a lot more things happening. So hopefully see you there. So thank you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.